Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Elvis. So, it's kind of interesting because we have a movie that I don't feel had the money to go on and buy rights to certain songs, it feels. Because we get a little snippets here and there of Elvis's songs, but we don't get like a full-on actual song anywhere. That's like really to have us also have like lot of modern kind of things kind of put into this film, that are also to kind of take and siphon off little bits of Elvis Presley music, because I guess they can't, like, it doesn't seem that this movie could have afforded to actually have a Elvis song, it seems, in this movie. So, because I'm sure that would have cost them a ton of money anyways. So, but going into this Elvis film, we have the story of Elvis, like, from birth till he's like 40 years old, and we have to cover every single thing. Him being in films, him going on and being in the military for 2 years, him breaking segregation laws, and all these kinds of things. But then eventually Elvis wanting to do things his own way, and eventually people are telling him no. So, within this story, I enjoyed it, but I'm like, man, this is such a long-winded tale. Because not only are you telling Elvis's story, but then you're also telling Colonel Parker, or Colonel Tom Parker's story, who is Tom Hanks's character. Like, you're basically telling his whole life story as well. So I'm like, oh my god, there is so much ground to have to cover in this movie, and you're really just telling, like, from person's life to person's death. But this is also such a visually interesting movie put out there, and I just really, I really also just enjoyed it. It was really just fun, to watch how all this was played out. I think that they were trying to also swerve away from, like, showcasing really that Elvis was to have at some points, like, had drug usage, because they try to go on and justify it by saying that it's like, well, Elvis was really very exhausted for a lot of these performances he had to go on and do. So a lot of times they would have to go and medicate him, simply because of all these performances he had to go on and do. So that was kind of really interesting to, like, justify the drug use. But not only that, we have Elvis, who was to lose people in his family for one reason or another, and that ends up getting played on into the story. So, with that said, I would have to easily say that this is an interesting film. This is possibly a long-winded but great film, because really it's to kind of, if none other Elvis movies were to have covered the whole history of this character, this goes in depth. But also, it kind of showcases that Elvis might not have actually wrote his own music. That Elvis had at some point maybe heard this song from somewhere and stole it. Because that's what this movie kind of says at some points, that maybe probably some of the songs that he was to be famous for might not have been his. Oddly enough, not quite sure, but that's what the movie showcases. That it seems that somebody is in the background singing this song that eventually Elvis will take and shift and make it his own. And that just seemed kind of very weird to me. Like, I get maybe wanting to showcase some of this music somehow or another, but, like, it also feels like Elvis is kind of hear this and like, I'm gonna take this from this person, I'm gonna take this from this. But also in really looking at it, who knows how well these songs are to have been already been an existing thing, and Elvis was to be like the first to go on and go public with it with his like gospel and all these kinds of different arrangements. So, anyways, it was also kind of interesting to find out that Elvis was actually a comic book fan, supposedly. That's what it says in the film. I don't know how accurate that is or how any number of things are legitimately accurate within this film. Because we've also had somebody like come forward and say like, "Hey, I was taking care of Elvis during this time period, and like I was never showcased in this movie whatsoever." So we kind of have to question the accuracy of the story at points, but like it seems that we have like the Presley family that was to go on and be interviewed and talked about this film. So they can go on and say how accurate or inaccurate this really was. So, with that said, currently right now this movie is to at some point be available on in theaters. I would recommend people checking it out, even though it's a 2.5 hour movie. Like I would recommend that there's some visually interesting things here. There is something really cool about Elvis Presley that I thoroughly just enjoyed in this film. Just kind of finding these little important things that people were to have remembered at some point, and eventually have me go on like, oh, like that's what happened during that point. Um, so with that said, let's go on and let's go into that double five time territory. Let's just go into spoilers. There's a number of certain apps that I would kind of tell people to go to uh, that could also have Elvis the movie available, but it's a very bootleg, very shoddy version. But you could still probably see this 2.5 hour movie and have to not have to sit through it in a theater. Instead, you can sit through it at home. Um, you can go on to a Google search, and first off, you can search the word "C Movies" app. So letter C, and eventually that'll have to take you to an app to download that eventually will have an updated app, and you can download the Yes Movies app that's inside there and eventually watch Elvis at some point. You can also go onto another app called Fox HD Movies. Regardless of what I say next, this might help or hinder you find this app quicker. Because the title of the Fox HD movies will be something different. It'll say Play 1080p HD movies. So there's that. And then there's another app that I've gone on to eventually use called TV Crush. 2 words. So, and eventually TV Crush will eventually have a kind of different kind of setup where it's called HD Movies 123 Movies. You can download this app. It has a logo with HD Movies and kind of a king crown off to the side. Go ahead and download that and be able to see whatever you like for absolutely free. So with that said, Elvis. Let's go on into spoilers. Hopefully, I'm going to be able to probably rush through this whole entire person's life story. I'm probably not going to remember everything, or I'm probably not going to want to spend time on every single detail this movie has. There's a lot to digest within 2.5 hours, so if there's something that I forget, let me know in the comments below, because eventually I'll just be like, well, alright, that's one thing that I forgot about. Because there's, like, scenes where, of course, Elvis is to have, like, tinfoil in his room, and eventually that's a part of this movie, that people were to have all kind of conspiracy stories of why Elvis was to put tinfoil on his windows. Probably because his eyes hurt, because of so many stage lighting things that freaking hurt his eyes over time. Because he had to do so many performances every single night. But anyways, and he never had a break. So, but anyways, like they end up covering like this guy's whole entire life. So let's get into it. Let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time to spoil this movie. So the beginning of Tale of Elvis is to been told via Colonel Tom Parker. So we have like Colonel Tom Parker's story, who's kind of covered like at first, and then how he was to get Elvis, and then eventually how like Elvis is to kind of have his own story, and then Colonel Tom Parker is to kind of be like put in there consistently because Tom Parker was to basically be Elvis's not exactly manager, because like Elvis's dad was his manager, but like Tom Parker was like contracted to Elvis and started the whole like Presley Enterprises thing. So they were contracted together to work together. So with that said, let's get into the beginning of this. So come to find out, we had Colonel Tom Parker, who at some point was to run off to be a carnival person. So he eventually went on and was to try to obtain these certain attractions. And one of the attractions ended up being Hank Snow. And so Tom was to go on and start getting these certain attractions to eventually have these like these hay rides that are go on and have these kind of musical ties to them, to where we have it in this movie to focus on the Louisiana hayride when eventually Elvis came along. So we go on and we have Tom Parker, who is to have his main attraction be Hank Snow in Texarkana, 1955. And so, come to find out, it seems that Hank Snow was to also have a son, Jimmy Rogers Snow, who was to also become a possible singing talent as well. And come to find out, we had Jimmy, who was to go on and buy this album, and it ended up being Elvis Presley's. And because everybody is crazily like playing this on the radio like all the time, like 20 some odd times over and over and over again, because people just loved Elvis Presley's music so much. So we have, of course, that supposedly Elvis Presley is to have gone on and been the opening act for Hank Snow, and we have Parker, we have the Colonel that is to go on and tell Jimmy, it's like, wait a minute, like I don't think that we're gonna go on and hire this kid, because supposedly they're saying that this kid Elvis Presley is a Sun Records guy, and we had Parker who was saying, well, like Sun Records used to hire, or would normally hire a specific kind of guy to go on and do the records, and I don't think we can like hire someone like that. And so Jimmy is to go on and say, it's like, well, guess what? Like Elvis Presley is doing this certain kind of style, and he's white. And they're like, what? So come to find out, Elvis Presley was to have gone on and been born a twin, but his twin was to have died in childbirth, sadly. So eventually Elvis was to go on and supposedly be a fan of comic books. I wouldn't know how much really accurate that is. They ended up showcasing Captain Marvel. That isn't actually Captain Marvel anymore. It's now Shazam. And so for people that are just like, wait a minute, Captain Marvel, that doesn't seem right. It's the early Shazam books. For those of you that don't know who, like like basically Justice League at some point in their cartoon was to eventually cover Captain Marvel, and it was the Shazam Captain Marvel. The reason why they changed it to finally Shazam is because legal battles. Because eventually there's two different comic book characters out there with the same name, so they changed it finally to Shazam. And really, I would say that also they probably should have changed it a long freaking time ago, anyways. Eventually, when Marvel was to actually create a Captain Marvel, it doesn't make sense anymore. Anyways, but man, does that suck to have to kind of Google something when you're going on and searching for either Captain Marvel or the older Shazam. It freaking sucks. It does. So, moving on, because this is going to take far too long to talk about within this movie, anyways. So, Elvis is to eventually go on and start opening up for Hank Snow. And so they go on and they hire this guy. And eventually it seems that if people were to make fun of him because his greased back hair or his makeup that he would wear at some points and his pink clothes, all of a sudden we had Elvis, who was to go on and change everybody's opinion about him. Just like, oh my god, this guy is something. And so he would go on and start to move his hips and do all these motions, and it would just drive the girls wild. To the point of them just be like going, oh my god, like to the point to where like they would just be uncontrollably just in awestruck of this man, and they couldn't control themselves. And so that all of a sudden was to eventually have, of course, Tom Parker and Elvis's parents like realizing like the influence that Elvis was to have on people. It was just uncontrollable. So, because I think before, instead of just calling this like Elvis, like there was kind of a number of kind of different names where it's kind of more of like a family or something like that, or they try to change the name and stuff like that, but eventually they just called like they just called it Elvis Presley for when he would go out there. So we also have to cover some more of Presley's backstory. So it seems that Presley would go on when he was a young kid and would eventually live in a certain kind of neighborhood that had a number of certain kind of people, let's just say, creatively, because I want to be sensitive. And so Elvis would go on and go to these like church rallies or these church meetings and would go on and find these songs and this music, and like he would just be so like consumed by it, and to where some people would be wanting to like pull Elvis back, but the preacher is telling them no, like he's feeling it, like he's feeling the Holy Spirit, just kind of let him go. So we would go on and have possibly Elvis at some points, from a number of times that he would go on, eventually be taking some music from somewhere that he was to have gone on and had someone sing to him at some point. So probably maybe not every single bit of all of this music that at some point Elvis was to sing was to always be his. It seems like the Hound Dog thing doesn't sound like it was his. It seems like there's a lot that was taken when he was a young lad, and so on and so forth throughout his years. So Elvis is to go on and basically like blow everybody away, and Hank Snow is like offended by Elvis to say like, well, hey, like I'm willing to have this guy like open for me, but he better not doing all those hip movements and things. Like, no, like I don't want to see him do that anymore. And Tom Parker was to eventually go on and tell Hank Snow, it's like, yeah, like I think that like I'm sorry, like this guy is just gonna do what he's going to do. Sorry. So like, but Tom, so the Colonel realized how valuable this guy was, and so the Colonel is to follow Elvis through a time of which that he's going on and trying all these amusement park and carnival rides. And Colonel is to take Elvis and is to tell him, it's like, well, hey, like, you know what? Like, I think it's time for like you and me to become partners, and like, but I want you to go on and kind of cut ties to all of your like attachments that you have, as well as I'm going to do the same. Like, I'm going to cut ties to Hank Snow, and I'm going to leave this all behind, and we're going to go on tours and do all these things. So, as well as also, Elvis is to go on and leave Sun Records to then go off and uh, go with RCA, who I guess is to have given Elvis like the biggest contract in the world. So we have Elvis who's to cut ties with his girlfriend. He's to sign a contract to have his father be Elvis's manager, and they're gonna put together Elvis Enterprises and do all this stuff. So we have Elvis going on and eventually leaving Sun Records to go to RCA. And so after this Louisiana hayride, and so eventually what happens is that we go on and we start to have the Colonel that is making merchandise off of Elvis by selling everything. Everything. Like, to the point where, like, there's, like, certain pins that say, I love Elvis and I hate Elvis. And they're like, wait a minute, like, why are you selling both? And the Colonel's like, well, like, you gotta, like, profit on, like, the good and the bad side. So you gotta, like, you're cornering a market, basically. So we go on, and Elvis is like, okay, sure, whatever. Like, just slap my face on everything, and like scarves and all kinds of things. That's perfectly fine. And supposedly, like, Elvis and the Colonel, like, their agreement was to split everything 50-50, even though Elvis was doing all the heavy lifting. Yeah, 50-50. Oh my god. To the point to where afterwards, like, the Colonel was trying to come after, like, Elvis at some point when Elvis was trying to jump his contract, but we'll get to that later. So Elvis is going on, and the world is starting to change. Like, Martin Luther King is eventually doing what he is doing. Eventually, we have Elvis that is to start to go in and meet with guys like B.B. King and see young stars like Little Richard playing on Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy, and doing all this like kind of ripping and tearing of his shirts. Little Richard, like, man, what a guy! Like, what an interesting guy. Eventually, later on, he went on and did like certain like reality shows and stuff like that, and like game stuff, and was like a coach or whatever, or was like a judge on some of those things. But it's kind of interesting to see like a young variation of Little Richard in this movie. So it seems that Elvis was to get into trouble to the point where it seems that with what Elvis is doing is breaking some kind of segregation laws, to where simply him moving his hips back and forth or doing what he's doing with his legs was somehow wrong, and they would call him on the newspaper Elvis the Pelvis, and like going on and saying that like everybody in the brother was telling Elvis like, hey, you better stop jucking and jiving anymore, you gotta stop moving them hips, like you better not move one finger back and forth, or I swear like you're gonna go to jail. So Elvis at that point is just getting so frustrated with everyone telling him what to do, to the point that he has this kind of fruition kind of moment talking to BB King, and BB King is telling Elvis like, "Hey man, like you're Elvis Presley. Like who's going to tell you what to do?" Like this is insane. Like is somebody really going to arrest you because you're freaking Elvis Presley? Really? So we have Elvis realizing that, and so Elvis finally goes to this one concert, and this concert is to, of course, have this uh, certain kind of rope between certain people within his concert, but allowing a bunch of people to all come if they want to, trying to be nice. Hopefully, it really sucks when there's a time period in time where you have to go on and mention things that like doesn't feel right anymore um, to mention in a movie, but that's always the thing. uh, you have to cover the history of all things. So going on, so Elvis was to go on and do this concert, and he wanted to do everything his way. He was sick of it all. So he goes on to this concert and is to finally just say, it's like, well, hey, like, you know what? Everybody's telling me what to do, and I'm sick of that, so I'm going to go on and do things my way. Um, Probably the reason why he went on and sang that song, I Did It My Way. And I did it my way. Yeah, because F yeah. Because Jesus. Um, so Elvis was to go on and do this concert and was to do it with all hips and all things. And so immediately they're going on and telling Elvis that he has two options. He can go to jail, or he can enlist in the army and spend 2 years in the army. So Elvis goes on and is to enlist in the army so that way they could cut his hair, and Elvis was to get shipped off to go to Germany, where the colonel is to tell Elvis that after his 2 years are up, Elvis could come back, and Parker is going to transition Elvis into a movie star. So hopefully there's not a ton that I've missed out already, because I feel like I have to kind of quickly go over a 2.5 hour movie, and I don't want to take 2 hours to do it. So I'm sorry if I'm really hugely leaving out chunks of this film, but there's also just like trying to condense it all down. So Germany in 1959. It seems that we not only have Elvis, who is to go off to the military, but he's also to go off and find love. So, because Elvis at one point is to possibly get hassled by a number of different women that are all to like mob him and find where he is to eventually have a hotel or any place that he's asleep. And man, does that have to just be freaking annoying, right? Everywhere he goes, probably a bunch of women are trying to jump his bones. Man, what a rough life, but still, like, that would just get annoying, especially when you have a woman that you love. And in Elvis's case, he ends up finding Priscilla Presley. Well, eventually Presley. So, in this film. So, Elvis is go on and meet with this girl, Presley, or Priscilla. And so afterwards, Elvis is to go on and start doing all these movies. But Elvis again is just like you know what, I'm kind of getting tired of these movies. Like all I ever wanted to do was to be a musician. I wanted to sing, and I want to do it my way. So eventually, Tom is to put up all these movies for Elvis to do, but he got really tired of them. So a lot of the movies, they just ended up making them faster and making them cheaper. And eventually, that's just how we had Elvis, who was to go on and do a lot of movies that he didn't want to ever do, and so that's probably why a lot of those movies didn't turn out so well, because Elvis never wanted to do or be a movie star. He just wanted to sing, and that's, I think, all he wanted to ever do. So, also, we have to mention the fact that while Elvis was away in Germany, Elvis's mother was to eventually take up drinking, and one thing led to another, and she died. So, at some point, Elvis was to kind of mourning his mother's loss, and I think he went into her closet and it's kind of like sniffing all of her clothes. And Tom Parker was to come in there and to tell Elvis, like, hey, like, try to like you should really try to go on and like try to comfort your dad right now. And so I think we end up having like photos being taken of Elvis and his father in freaking mourning, and I'm like, oh my god, that is horrible. Um, and I'm just like, wow, what a piece of work that eventually, like, hey, get all these cameras in here, so we can showcase this grieving. And I'm just like, wow. Hopefully that wasn't legitimately a thing that happened in real life, because I'm like, man, that is freaking awful. The worst moment of this guy's life is being shot in with all these cameras to cover this. So, pushing on. So, Elvis does all these movies and then is to to go back into music. And so we start to have Elvis, who is starting to have some dissension against Tom Parker. Elvis is starting to look into some guys like Steve Binder and Jerry Schilling to try to put him back on the map. It's because these guys have worked with the Rolling Stones and have worked with some substantial people in the past. So Elvis is supposedly at the Hollywood sign. Like, I don't think you can just kind of like be there now. Like, it's not so easy to go on and be at that location now, but still, for this movie and it being like the 50s. So we have Elvis going on and speaking to these guys, and they're going to put on this like TV special with Elvis. And so supposedly the TV special was supposed to be like all Christmas music, and Elvis is like, well, like, if I'm going to go and do this, I'm going to do it my way. So Tom Parker is saying like, yeah, we can go on and have you do all these Christmas songs, and like he's talking to the NBC like executive or whatever, and he's like, yeah, this guy better go on and do some kind of Christmas music somewhere. And so instead, Elvis goes on in his black leather, comes in there and just kind of sings all of his old songs, and then eventually a assassination attempt had happened, and as well as also them covering what happened with Martin Luther uh, King Jr. and that Elvis, like, that really struck him hard, um, as well as like the assassinations um, of Kennedy's, not quite exactly sure. Um, so Elvis turns around in this one moment, and instead of being tempted to play a Christmas song for this one last thing, he instead turns around and kind of pours his heart out in this song, and all these news places cover it. It's like, Elvis is back, like, man, this is incredible, like, this is the one thing that the world needed. So we also have like both Steve Binder and I think it was Jerry Schilling, who go on and tell Elvis that it's kind of weird that Elvis wasn't to go on and do tours overseas. Like, he could have gone on in Japan and somewhere overseas, and he could have easily gotten like $1 million to just do that. And Elvis is like, well, yeah, I don't know why either. And here's also the interesting thing. When Elvis was to go on and eventually sign with RCA, like, Elvis was to go on and was to be so very close with his mother to the point of wanting to get her the pink Corvette that eventually, like, we see in like certain um, like movies and stuff like that, like the whole pink Corvette kind of thing. So we have Elvis going on and saying that he wants to always be close to his mother, but eventually with all this touring, it kind of tore them apart, and longer it seems that Elvis wasn't always home that often. But then eventually Elvis was to be so rich that he was to be able to afford Graceland, and so we have Elvis eventually going on, and still there was a lot more money to be made. And so Elvis was in his like mind thinking, it's like, well, why is it that like Tom Parker wouldn't let me go on and let me tour overseas? Come to find out, Colonel Tom Parker was to be in very deep with some loan sharks at a casino. And so Tom Parker, instead of wanting to have Elvis go overseas, because it seems that Tom Parker had some gambling addiction, because it's obviously shown even in the beginning of this film, where Tom would kind of go on and be at this blackjack table or be hitting this slot machine. So, like, showcasing that this guy is already gambling on finding a guy like Elvis. And so, like, this guy is to just continue to gamble because it seems that he's getting unlimited money. So Elvis is to go on and is to eventually keep on with Tom Parker. And so Tom Parker is giving Elvis this Las Vegas room for him to go to for 10 years to perform there. And so this is when Elvis is starting to get very exhausted and is really just starting to have forcibly get drugs pumped into him so he can do performances, because he has to just keep going. So Tom Parker is to go on and talk to these casino guys, because this, of course, was the casino that Tom was indebted to. So Elvis is now like solving Tom Parker's debts, and it's like, what the fuck? So Tom Parker goes on to talk to the guy that is owning this casino. Is telling him like, well, hey, like if you let this guy for every year come in here and perform these 10 years, we'll go on and we'll not only clean your debt, but then you'll be uh, your like you won't ever have debt again. Like you'll be able to like play as long as you ever want and no debt. So like as if like the house is going to be able to collect everything that this guy has to go on and do. So Elvis goes on and is to do like 4, 5 performances in this international casino in Las Vegas, or in this international building. So Elvis is to find out about Tom Parker and that he actually isn't a person that has a like birth certificate or anything like that, and that Elvis finds out that Tom Parker is to be an alien, an illegal alien that has no country. So Elvis is to take one of these performances out on Tom Parker, and it's to showcase them in the crowd. And so Elvis is saying, like, you know what, this is going to be my last performance because I'm having to pay off every bit of Tom Parker's debts because, man, does he have a lot of them. And as well as, like, Elvis having to get drugged to continue on. So Elvis eventually is to go on at some point in this movie and have a kid with Priscilla, and that of course was Lisa Marie, and he ends up naming his plane that he ends up buying because Elvis is so rich he has a plane. And you would think that eventually, once he turned 40, once he got broke, he would go on and just sell that plane, but I guess not. So Elvis goes on and is to name the plane Lisa Marie for his kid. And when I was like, oh wow, that's a nice sentiment. Just going like, no, like I'm gonna name this after my baby, my child. But eventually, it seems that Priscilla and Elvis's relationship starts to fall and crumble because Elvis, when he was to go on and perform on stage, like that was all of the love that he was to ever need, and like the love of his fans. And so eventually it seemed that he started to fall out of love with Priscilla, supposedly, allegedly. So we finally have Priscilla who confronts Elvis and is saying like, well, you know what, like I didn't mind that you had all these women and you were running through them, like basically meaning that he was sleeping with them all the time. Like she didn't mind that, but like it comes a time when it feels that like this guy is never there. And so eventually like it just tore them apart. So Elvis was to go on and want to get away from Tom Parker, and Tom Parker was to try to sue Elvis because breach of contract. So Elvis was getting very upset with Tom because it's like, wait a minute, like this guy was taking like 50% of everything that I made, and still like this guy is still coming after me. Like this guy is still like going on and still wanting to be a vampire and suck the life out of me, to the point of him of like Elvis having a doctor like available all the time for this guy to, at any whim of any time, to just pump this guy of drugs or medication, let's just say, to have Elvis just keep going on. So we go further into this story, and so Elvis was to go on and put all these like Christmas albums out and put all these kind of certain albums out, like all these cover albums out. Um, but then eventually Elvis more and more is to eventually like have to go on and still perform somehow or another, because really he needs the money. When Elvis hits 40, come to find out, like, Elvis is broke. And I'm like, oh my God. To the point where, like, Elvis's father is turning to Elvis and saying, like, yeah, we're gonna lose Graceland. We're gonna lose everything. So you need to go on and, like, continue to perform. And by that time, I'm sure Elvis is so beat up by that by that time, because he's never really had the ability to save anything. He just has to go on and continue. And I'm like, yeah, that's what happens when you like go on and have like this lifestyle and you never save anything. Um, and then also the drug use to kind of just uh, keep the pain at bay, keep whatever at bay. So Elvis is to supposedly by the end of this film, and more than likely at some point I'm gonna have to backpedal and cover a lot of other different things randomly that'll pop into my brain. But so Elvis by the end of this movie is to go on and talk to Priscilla and mention that he's gonna be 40 soon, and like what has he really accomplished, and kind of looking like back at his life. So Elvis is kind of mention, or Priscilla's to kind of mention Elvis. It's like, you know what, like Elvis, like why can't you just go on and just finally just rest, like, and Elvis is like, well, I can't. I gotta go on and do like A Star Is Born, supposedly, which turned out that just didn't happen. He was, I guess, supposedly going to do the remake of The Star Is Born, and like during that time, I guess there was a guy, some news reporter or something, that was mentioning, or some radio guy that was mentioning that since Elvis is technically by that time like a washed up singer, that it's like, man, this is going to be a huge stretch for him to go on and do this movie. And I'm like, oh my God, like this is freaking Elvis Presley you're talking about here. Like, come on. Um, and for how this guy had to struggle throughout his life, and eventually get mauled to where he couldn't go anywhere, to where we had the moment where Elvis's mother is consistently telling Elvis, like, hey, like, don't go out anywhere, like, don't go out, don't party too much. And Elvis is like, dude, I'm doing nothing. I'm sitting in my room just doing nothing. And he's just on his bed just consistently sleeping because that's all he could do, because if he went out he ended up getting mobbed by people. So there was nowhere he could go. There was nothing he could do. Probably like it feels like they didn't really say it, but it seemed that Elvis like had like possibly a depression, it seemed. But who knows? Like eventually it has that kind of feeling, but like for how this guy was to go on and have these certain songs where a lot of people are saying like, yeah, this sounds like a song about like ending his own life. This seems very weird. Like I don't think that we should go on and have him do that kind of song, but he ended up doing anyways. Um, like that whole song about him being so lonely, and I'm like, wow, yeah. When really looking back on that, yeah, there are certain songs where there is um, some kind of gospel things going on there, but then there's also other times where like there's a lot of songs what for what Elvis did that was kind of risky. Um, But hey, that's the roll of the dice that you do when you just kind of create this song, not thinking of the impact later on. Because I would go on and say that too. That eventually, there's gonna be some song out there that it's like, oh yeah, like this sounds cool. Like it sounds interesting. It has a really cool hook or whatever. But then all of a sudden, YouTube is to go on and be like, oh yeah, you probably shouldn't be like singing this kind of song. Like that doesn't seem appropriate. And so eventually a video ends up getting taken down off of your YouTube because you went on and did some song that might not have been appropriate. Whatever. That's always the goofy thing about YouTube. Uh, what song was it? What lyrics were they? I can't say them because then this video would get taken down. So going back, so Elvis. So Elvis was to even have a point where he was wanting to cut ties with Tom Parker, even after he was almost willing to like fire him, and Elvis was going to like cut ties with Tom Parker by the time that Tom Parker was to have a heart attack, and like Parker was saying that he like threw his back out, but when he went to the actual hospital, they said, "Oh no, he had a heart attack." So Elvis was saying like, "Yeah, I think I'm gonna cut ties with you," and Tom Parker's like, "Yeah, I had a heart attack." So I was like, "Wow, that's pretty crazy." Kind of a story, but it's like that's how just life happens. That's how life works. So back so Elvis was possibly going on to film A Star Is Born, and that just didn't happen. And the role ended up getting recasted. And so supposedly there's kind of really interesting things to have found out about Elvis at some points in time. Supposedly Elvis used to go on and used to have a whole floor for a hotel room or a whole floor for a hospital that he like made sure that he had like his own thing to where he would never get mauled or anything like that. Um, so man, I was like, yeah, that probably cost a ton of money to try to like get his own privacy. And supposedly that was like the alleged thing. I'm not quite sure if that's really true or not. Um, there's a number of things that kind of people had conspiracy about, like the whole tinfoil of the windows, and when really looking at it, like Elvis had tinfoil over these windows and was to have sunglasses on. There must have been something like maybe he would get like migraines a lot from all the bright lights on stages. That could have been the case. Because I would get migraines from bright lights. Also, there was quite a frequent amount of times where I would go on, and even on videos at some point I'd have like sunglasses on just because like I would have migraines. So maybe that would be the case for Elvis. Not quite sure, but also with Elvis, like a lot, he would have to not only deal with uh, like stage lighting, but then he would also get like bombarded with flash photography and stuff like that. So I'm sure the combination of all of those things probably would hurt his eyes. I'm sure after all the impacts of lighting and stuff like that. So with that said, we had Elvis who was talking to Priscilla, and was going off on this plane, and he turns to Priscilla and tells her that he will always love her, and he goes off on this plane and is to supposedly leave to go off and do A Star Is Born, supposedly, but it doesn't work out. So supposedly afterwards, Presley was to die at age 42. I'm like, oh my god, 42. Supposedly there's a lot of different stories of how Elvis was to have died. This movie says that he died of a heart attack. Some people were to have gone on and said that he died on the toilet, sadly. Um, really, like, because if you go on to, God, what was it? If you go on to the movie Father Stew, the Mark Wahlberg movie, at the beginning of that, Mel Gibson has this story that supposedly, since Elvis liked to eat a lot of peanut butter sandwiches, that eventually Elvis died on the toilet. I'm like, man, that sounds like an awful way to go. But also, like, when you think about it, like the accumulation of all those drugs and all these things that he was to put his body through probably shortened his lifespan anyways, and plus all the performances all the time, everything that he had to do, to the point where in 1977, the last performance that Elvis did, like, he couldn't even stand. And like, so it's like, yeah, that's I feel so bad for Elvis, for possibly having so many things um, that were to go on and bring up so many things about Elvis that may not even be true. Just the lore about this man, that somebody would have so many different stories about Elvis at some points. But so the typed thing at the end was after Elvis was to go on and die, Presley's family was to go after Tom Parker and was to sue him for eventually having a like the contract that they had with him. And so supposedly, since Tom Parker was of course not to be a legal citizen, he settled with the Presley family in court. So hopefully the Presley family got all that they thought was to uh, be out of that. And so, yeah, and they kind of end up showing little blips and little things, of course, in this movie that kind of led to the end of this film. But it just kind of feels oddly placed to where it's like, okay, what are they talking about here? But then we end up finding out at the end of it, like, what the court case meant when Tom Parker was to be asked about being a legitimate citizen for the United States. Um, so other than that, let me know in the comments below if there's a number of things that I probably forgot about within this movie, because it's 2.5 hours. There's a lot of stuff to pick through. I'm sure if I were to have watched this another time and re-reviewed it, there'd probably be a number of items, a number of things that eventually I would forget about, because there's a lot of just detail about this person's whole entire life that at some point I would have quickly forgotten, or there's too much to cover in ipso facto specific names of certain areas, because heaven forbid you have to remember 2.5 hours of all kinds of things fairly easily. But with that said, hopefully that covers Elvis for everybody. Is it perfect? No, but at the end of the day, I'm going to say I'm just going to get out of here because it's 2.5 hours of a movie. And I spent an hour almost reviewing it. Oh my god. A whole entire day of Elvis. Because, really, my dad was supposedly a fan of Elvis. Really to have gone on and have certain dates that was tied to Elvis at some point. Anniversaries and stuff like that. And to kind of know some history about Elvis even before this movie, to have gone on and at some point seen little pieces in here and there of Elvis's movies at some points, and to have gone on and known some history about Elvis is just kind of really interesting before even getting into this film. Eventually, my mother was to, of course, at some point, like, live in Memphis. So at some point she toured like the outside of Graceland, because supposedly during that time there were certain Elvis relatives that were still living in the house, so they toured on the outside, and that is kind of interesting. And eventually it seems that at some point one of my relatives was to have gone on and had a picture like taken at some point in Elvis's life. So interesting, yeah. So with that said, I'm just gonna get out of here. So goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.